Week 15, Overview, Manifest Destiny. This week, we'll look at the big picture of progress in America from the mid-1830s to 1850 or so. We'll quickly survey three presidencies, those of Martin Van Buren, William Henry Harrison, and John Tyler, and overview ways that America expanded during this period. In future weeks, we'll spend more time studying details of events that we look at only briefly and in a larger context this week, such as the everyday lives of pioneers as they trekked across the American plains, the Plains Indian Wars that resulted as Indian and white cultures clashed in the West, the Mexican-American War following the annexation of Texas, the work on the Transcontinental Railroad, the installation and effects of the telegraph, and the California Gold Rush. The big idea that dominated these days was America's manifest destiny. The years between 1830 and 1850 saw a huge, voluntary westward push among white Americans as they sought to occupy the continent from sea to shining sea. In 1845, a journalist named John O'Sullivan captured the expansionist, can-do spirit of the age that mingled with a religious sense of both duty and purpose with his now famous phrase of manifest destiny. 6 years earlier, O'Sullivan had already expressed the essence of the phrase when he wrote, "The expansive future is our arena, and for our history. We are entering on its untrodden space with hearts unsullied by the past. We are the nation of human progress, and who will, what can, set limits on our onward march? Providence is with us, and no earthly power can. We point to the everlasting truth on the first page of our national declaration, and we proclaim to the millions of other lands that the gates of hell, the powers of aristocracy and monarchy, shall not prevail against it." The concept of manifest destiny was rich with religious connotations. James Buchanan said, "Providence has given to the American people a great and glorious mission to perform, of extending the blessings of Christianity and of civil and religious liberty over the whole North American continent. This will be a glorious spectacle to behold. This spirit cannot be repressed. We must fulfill our destiny." Not everybody liked this new idea. New York Representative Charles Goodyear declared, "I regretted to hear the sentiment of manifest destiny avowed in an American Congress, because it has ever been used to justify every act of wholesale violence and rapine that ever disgraced the history of the world." His statement crystallized the thoughts of some that manifest destiny was simply an excuse to overrun those who stood in the way of America's lust for land. Many Northerners were afraid that further expansion in the Southwest would lead to more states being accepted as slave states, thus disrupting the fragile balance in Congress. The tensions over slavery were growing stronger and stronger. That's because the Age of Jackson was turning into the Age of the Abolitionists. Jackson's emphasis on the dignity of labor and the value of the common man was a little hard to square with continued bondage for black Americans. Abolitionism, as such, really took shape in the 1830s. Your children will be learning a number of names made famous by their struggle against slavery. There was Harriet Beecher Stowe, for example. When her family moved from Connecticut to Cincinnati, Ohio, just across the river from the slave-holding state of Kentucky, she had a personal view of the struggle of slaves for their freedom. She used what she learned there to write Uncle Tom's Cabin. Frederick Douglass was one of America's first black leaders. Born a slave in Maryland, the boy Frederick taught himself to read and then taught other slaves to read the New Testament. In 1838, he ran away to New York City. He began to speak at anti-slavery events and soon became famous on both sides of the Atlantic as he spoke out against slavery. William Lloyd Garrison was the head of the abolitionist movement in the United States. He was a journalist. Although he wasn't popular with all abolitionists, he was determined to see slavery abolished no matter what the cost. Each of these abolitionists shared the same goal, the complete end of slavery. They wanted individual Americans to commit themselves to that goal, even if it might take years to achieve it. Various abolitionists used various methods. Garrison used newspapers. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a novel, while others used mass meetings, like the revivalists of the Great Awakenings. The seeds that they planted in the Age of Jackson helped ignite a civil war. Even as the abolitionists insisted that the Union stand up for African slaves, other Americans were being cheated out of the rights that had been conferred on them by solemn treaties. The Cherokee, Seminole, Choctaw, Creek, and Chickasaw were called the 5 civilized tribes. They were called civilized since they had adopted a more European lifestyle than other Indian tribes. Many such civilized tribesmen had established villages in which they assimilated many of the American ways of farming. They were efficient and skilled farmers and hunters. They had a written language and had excellent medical knowledge. Starting in 1830, the Indian Removal Act required these tribes to abandon their hereditary lands for reservations in what is now eastern Oklahoma. They called this forced migration the Trail of Tears. The Trail of Tears is a sad tale, but well worth telling. The Choctaw tribe, the first to go, chose to move west voluntarily. One Choctaw chief explained why in a letter he wrote to the American people. "We as Choctaws rather chose to suffer and be free than live under the degrading influence of laws which our voice could not be heard in their formation." Nearly 15,000 Choctaws made the move to what is now Oklahoma, but somewhere between 2,500 and 6,000 of them died along the way because of poor planning and a lack of supplies. The Choctaw who stayed in their ancestral lands were harassed, attacked, and intimidated. The Chickasaws had a little easier. They were the only tribe to get paid for their homelands. The Creek Indians begged President John Quincy Adams to protect them, but the governor of Georgia ignored the federal government and drove them off the land anyway. The Cherokee went to court to fight removal and won a Supreme Court victory, but President Jackson refused to enforce it. The Seminole Indians of Florida were the last of the 5 civilized tribes to lose their homeland. They did not go peaceably. The Second Seminole War lasted from 1832 until 1842. General Andrew Jackson had earned part of his fame in the First Seminole War from 1814 to 1819. The last Seminoles held onto their tribal lands until 1847. Native Americans weren't the only people who were forced to move out west. There were white Americans who were threatened with violence back east who wound up settling Utah. The Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, usually known as the Mormons, journeyed west in 1846 under a cloud of controversy. Rhetoric students, who follow our church history thread, will be learning about their unique perspective on life in 19th century America. Let's quickly review the presidents, whose terms made up what we call the Age of Jackson. There was Jackson himself, of course, followed by his good friend and Vice President Martin Van Buren, founder of the Democratic Party. Van Buren was the first president born after 1776, so he was an American citizen from birth. He's also the only president yet who didn't speak English as his first language. He grew up speaking Dutch. He took office 5 weeks before the economic panic of 1837 shut down the banks in New York City and kicked off a 5-year-long depression. The Democrats nominated him for a second term in 1840, but he was voted out of office after a single term, before the economy got going again. Van Buren was beaten by William Henry Harrison, a Whig and the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe. As governor of the Indiana Territory, Harrison had led federal forces against Chief Tecumseh's warriors. That battle helped trigger the War of 1812, which is what made General Jackson famous. Harrison ran a hard-charging and successful campaign. He successfully, although unfairly, characterized Van Buren as an aristocrat who was out of touch with the people. Harrison gave the longest inaugural address in U.S. history and served the shortest term. It was cold and rainy on March 4, 1841, when he took the oath of office, but he insisted on reading his entire 8,000-word speech, even though it took him nearly 2 hours. Then he rode through the streets of Washington in a parade. That may or may not explain why, 3 weeks later, Harrison came down with pneumonia. He died on April 4th, 30 days after taking office. Harrison's vice president, John Tyler of Virginia, then claimed the title of president. Back then, the Constitution said the vice president took over the president's duties if he died, but it never said he actually took the title of president. That detail was cleared up by the 25th Amendment, enacted after John F. Kennedy was killed. This constitutional question wouldn't have been a big deal if Tyler had been a loyal Whig, but he had been a Democrat until he accepted the Whigs' nomination for vice president. Though he claimed the office and proceeded to act accordingly, his opponents never admitted that he was really president, referring to Tyler as His Accidency instead of His Excellency. Tyler didn't start with any political capital of his own, and he made things worse when he vetoed everything the Whigs came up with. In short order, Tyler was formally expelled from the Whig Party, and everybody in his cabinet resigned, except for Daniel Webster, his Secretary of State. Tyler didn't even run for re-election, and the next president, James K. Polk, brought Jacksonian democracy back in force. It was the Age of Jackson, after all. America was young and sure of itself, flexing new muscles and showing new strength. There's much to admire about the new nation, Yet there is much, in hindsight, that Christians now regret. The power of the common man was on the rise, and woe be to anything or anyone that got in his way: Eastern elites, the Mexican border, or Native Americans.